had our first protest, and this is to give you background on Ames. Ames is about 67,000 people. However, the issue is with Ames is it's predominantly white area, so it's not necessarily the best place to protest because over 80% of the population is white and under 3% Black, under 4% Latino. So when you're looking to voice yourself, you're not necessarily having such a large community that might align with your views, as well as we did have a live KKK chapter in Ames as well as in the surrounding areas. So I think a big thing that a lot of folks don't talk about is we can all say when we're looking to decolonize, particularly make change, protesting plays a huge role in that, yet there's no curriculum that exists today that educates us on how to properly do that. And the issue is, it's a lot of youth that are going into it and we have them learning from trial and error. Yet the consequences are very, very extreme. So once we started going into it, we started learning from our, trials and errors through protests, what to expect, whether it's how we keep ourselves safe from opposition, white supremacists that might be coming in. We have protests where, we have people circle around with cars, and our biggest fear is what if someone, runs through a crowd, right? That's the last thing we want to happen. So we have to take safety precautions. So one thing we started doing here was literally just reading about past protests that have happened before us, right? Protests that have happened in Charlottesville, protests that have happened in Hong Kong, protests that have happened in other places in Iowa. And what we started doing was, once we're reading about it, we started seeing, okay, where have these issues come up and what can we do to mitigate them? So for example, everyone that's heard about Charlottesville and what happened there was literally a car that just ran straight through the crowd. Yet someone was necessarily not coming from a road, yet knew that this crowd was going to march by this street and was waiting in a parking lot. So they literally just waited in this parking lot, and as the crowd passed, they ran through them. So for us, one thing we started doing was we would never announce a route, right? And on top of that, we'd make sure we'd have cars both in front of the crowd and behind the crowd, because the last thing we'd want is someone to hit the crowd. So if it hit a car, everyone would hear that and people can disperse in that sense. On top of that, how do we deal with police interactions, right? Our goal is to protest, and with that, our goal is to disrupt, right? We want to disrupt and to bring attention to this issue. However, we have police all around us. In regards to navigating those interactions, that's another thing there. Like no one teaches about that. Whereas in the field of international relations, we can all say when we look at decolonizing, this is something that plays a big role. We need to protest in order to make changes in certain places in this world. However, no one can ever teach you how to properly protest. And I think there's a huge need for being able to teach us about this thing, or a centralized pool of knowledge for it. So one thing we started doing was I pretty much ended up driving to Des Moines, Iowa City, and gathered some folks together and saying, we are all main organizers in our respective cities. What are the issues y'all ran into and how have you kind of overcome them? One thing we've seen, for example, in Des Moines is they were extremely effective at what they were doing, to the point where police weren't just using regular tactics. They were not using just regular equipment. They ended up upgrading from pretty much the regular riot gear you see to military equipment, right? And military tactics. They would use pressurized hoses, right? And use them not with water, but with mace. And if you aren't looking, you can get maced with a pressurized hose and it could put you on your ass. And things of that nature, things you have to be considerate of when you're thinking of protesting. But for us, we're able to talk about, okay, how can we mitigate that? So we literally have people come in with little shields and just to protect the crowd in those scenarios. And another thing too is in Iowa City, outside of protests, we'd have protesters that actually get flagged down by police just on their day-to-day life. So they'd be followed, harassed for basic things, simply just driving home or simply just being watched while they are at home. They just have a police car outside their home. And these are things that you're not going to see in the media, right? And the biggest thing is we don't necessarily control the media. Yet we have to do things like go on social media to be able to tell our own narrative, to tell our own stories, and have spaces like this where we can kind of share these stories, right? With that being said, we were able to implement plenty of, strategies, whether it's buddy systems, making sure people don't actually just go out after certain times, right? And implementing the fact that one thing I do is before I drive home is I make sure I circle around my home a couple times just to make sure I'm not being followed prior to actually entering my home. And these are all things we have to take into account. And before we can also talk about how to start protests, there always needs to be a need for you to build a coalition prior to just saying, I'm going to go out here. All right. You can't ever just walk out and expect a protest, because a leader with no followers is just a person walking. Right. You're on your own at that point. You need a coalition. You need people behind you. You need people that support your ideas, people that want to support the changes you want to see at the end of the day. And with that being said, prior to protesting, you need to also ask, what is the goal of this? What outcome do you want to see? So you can't just go on the street without any expectations. Do you want to see a change in legislation? Do you want to see changes to your school board? You need to have a plan after this. And from that, how are you going to execute that plan? So for us, we were particularly focused on the Ames City Council as well as Iowa State's University. So our first protest was particularly focused on Iowa State. And one thing about Iowa State that most people don't know, and even the students here don't know, is we have our liberal arts building named after Carrie Chapman Hall. And for you, those of you that don't know who that is a white supremacist. Iowa State, right, wants to ensure that all students are doing well. They want their value proposition is getting a degree, yet their retention rates for, Black men at Iowa State are below 60%, whereas their white peers are around 80%. Same thing for Black women, Latino women, Latino men. These retention rates are not where they need to be. And we can all understand that if we pay for a service at the end of the day, and I pay the exact same as my peers, I expect to get the same quality of service, yet we are not getting that same quality of service. So we end up going to pretty much protest. And after that first protest, the first thing we did was email our president to set up a time to meet and to talk to her about the exact demands we just protested for. Another thing that is not taught when you're protesting is how to negotiate for your changes and particularly apply that pressure, right? You can protest as much as you want, yet we protest due to the fact that we are not the decision makers ourselves. If you are someone that is a decision maker, you don't need to protest. You pretty much just make a decision at the end of the day, and the changes you want to see are implemented. So we end up going to the president of Iowa State, and with the president of Iowa State, we ended up asking her about Iowa State's, prison relationships first and foremost is one thing we ask about. And one thing they won't tell you is the majority of furniture you see at your universities are actually being built by inmates, which are supporting, Iowa State's prison relationships. But that's not just true Iowa State, but most universities will have their furniture built by prison industries. Yet there's a law that states here in Iowa that if a bid is quote unquote fair, it is technically a requirement for the university to use these prison industries. However, it is hard to determine if a bid is fair due to the fact that they actually do not disclose the bidding process, and it's not an open process that people can see how much is bidded yet. With prisons, they don't have to pay minimum wage, so they can easily just calculate, if we paid minimum wage, how much it would cost us to be profitable, and to just end up pretty much underbidding their competition that way. So that's a rule we're trying to implement, and pretty much saying, yes, it should be fair. However, there should be a limit as to what the lowest bid could be for the prison industry. And it has to be one that still allows for competition relative to everyone else that pretty much that's in that industry. Yet it's hard to get that pushback due to the fact that now we're not just fighting the president of the university. There are state legislators, as well as people within the state of Iowa, and people that profit from this multi-billion-dollar industry that don't want to see things like this happen. And that's another thing, that there's no curriculum that trains you for that, particularly in the state of Iowa, where less than 5% of the population is Black and people that look like you. However, a fourth of our prison population is Black folks at the end of the day, and that's not something Iowa is looking to confront. You're actually 7 to 8 times more likely to get pulled over if you're a person of color here in Iowa. With these conversations, we're continuously having them. Yet at the same time, we're also students. We're also people that have jobs. And another thing with protesting is you run into burnout. Burnout is huge. And the biggest thing to remember is this is not a moment, but a movement, right? In order to keep this sustainable, we have to make sure that at the end of the day, after I graduate, after someone else graduates, this is something that can continue Yet at the same time, it's hard to ensure due to the fact that there have been protests here in Iowa State 25 years before us. And there's been an ongoing thing every year. And Iowa State has employed the exact same tactics year after year because we've had the opportunity to talk to people that protested before us. And their tactic is, let's just create committees that will use up their time and energy, burn them out, and stall them out to the point that they just pretty much end up graduating. When they get to that point, they just pretty much say, okay, well, this group's gone, they got the degree, and they're moving out of Iowa. Because it's part of the reason Black folks just do not stay in Iowa. Now you get your next wave of leadership that comes in, and the same policies and committees have been implemented, particularly when it comes to changing the name of Cat Hall, which is the hall named after this white supremacist. The first protest for that was 25 years ago, and it's happened year after year after year. And every year they say, let's make a committee, let's make a committee. And it's happened every single year, and this is what they proposed this year. But the issue is now they keep talking about committees, they keep talking about collecting data, yet our issue is never the process itself. They will always try to say, well, we have this system and we have to follow this process. Well, that process you've been trying this process for 25 plus years. Our issue isn't the process, our issue is the decision itself. Now, when we get into the decision component, what we have to realize is this group actually racist? Or are they maybe uneducated? Or is there some sort of vested interest, which kind of ties back into the family that is tied to the name of this hall has donated over 30 million to the university. And pretty much what we're seeing from this university is that they're valuing financial incentive rather than what it means for students of color here to be supported and for them to not actually just condemn white supremacy. And now we're in a new challenge now. We have to call that out. But even though we call that out, it's been called out 25 plus years. We're at an interesting point now where how do we take it to the next step? So for us right now, we're trying to figure out how do we take this to the next step to truly get to that change and continue to put them on blast. And for them, if they're continuing to bring in students every year, they're going to continue to make revenue. And if they continue to make revenue, all we are to them is just a student yelling at them, right? So if we're able to maybe inform students of color prior to them actually getting here about what Iowa State's actually doing, that's going to turn students away. And we're also at an interesting point in time where due to COVID, there's actually about 300 institutions that are projected to not be able to financially recover from this. And for the first time, probably I think in our lifetime for us young folks, that people are starting to ask the question, what is the value proposition of a degree? For the first time, it's small echoes here and there, and people are wondering what are alternatives. If these alternatives start to pop up, people will start to look for other options if the service is not being met. Because at the end of the day, universities are corporate institutions first, academic institutions second, is my belief, right? It's the same reason that JP Morgan will hire an investment banker. Iowa State, as well as even Tufts University, has investment bankers strictly just to manage their endowment and make them more money. And whereas the last maybe 10 to 20% of that money is flexible and is what it's actually used on the students at the end of the day. It's also why you see more hiring of adjacent professors versus tenured professors who are going to be doing that research and advancing academic knowledge. And that's just one component of it, right? That we're trying to protest while we have a whole city of just pretty much folks that are complicit in this too. So now after having these conversations here with Iowa State, we're going to city council now. We're fighting a battle on two fronts. And what we're trying to tackle with city council is changes in legislation. We were fairly successful in trying to get them to push more progressive legislation, but at the end of the day, another thing that's hard is you want to take someone a mile, yet they only take a couple steps, right? So the legislation we're kind of seeing here in Ames is we've been able to get them to recommend 21 things that are going to be more progressive and better to pretty much help marginalized communities. An issue with that is, though, they'll recommend something such as, okay, we'll remove all military vehicles from our police department. Yet they are not willing to extend it to all military equipment, right? That's a whole nother conversation itself. And we're trying to implement more and more changes there. So we're actually taking a unique approach with this. Whereas what we're trying to do now is, rather than having us be going back and forth on legislation saying, no, you're wrong, this is what it is, we propose something else. Our goal is to better the city of Ames, and as city council members, their goal is to better the city of Ames. So we're trying to actually build a pipeline of communication with marginalized communities right now, because in Ames, they actually told us they had the most feedback from the city that they've ever had before. The sad part is, though, we've only been able to get 600 people give feedback. That's not even 10% of the whole population. And this issue is very prevalent in most cities. And with marginalized communities, we're struggling today. We don't have the privilege of worrying about tomorrow, especially if you're someone that comes from a low-income neighborhood. You're thinking about, okay, I have a low-income job, which is 9 times out of 10 physically demanding. At the end of the day, strategy work is what pays you money, whereas physically demanding work doesn't. You're coming home from a physically demanding job, and in some cases, someone goes to another physically demanding job, and then might even have their third job, which is their family. By the time all that is over, you're looking to just rest and prepare for the next day. You're not going to have time to go to a city council forum and just voice your concerns. And on top of that, there have been folks that have done that. And their perspective is, I've done it, yet the city doesn't hear me out and is not implementing actionable change, right? Now, what we're getting the city to do is they're trying to tell us, well, wouldn't it help for marginalized communities to just run for office? The funny part about that is a city council position here in Ames pays $10K a year. You can make double that salary as a Walmart employee. And on top of that, deal with a lot less crap. So less of a financial burden and a less of a mental burden to be a Walmart employee. And at the same time, we have people on our city council who make well over 200K a year and believe that this position should not even pay a cent. So we're also redialing back on all this, where we're trying to get to a point where we need some sort of understanding here before we can even negotiate. So with this being said, we're launching a project with the city of Ames where we're pretty much going to make them go out into these communities, because they too admit that they're not doing a good job of communicating with the actual communities that exist here. And we're implementing strategies that are going to be something as simple as writing an envelope to low-income neighborhoods and ask them, how can we make the city better? Best city of Ames. Going into subsidized housing, putting up whiteboards that just say, how can we make the city better, and leaving Sharpies there so people can write. Strategies that also are going to look at, all right, let's see the police data. What places are heavily policed right now? And truly just getting as much data out there as possible, because now with all this information existing in front of them, if they're truly not going to make these actionable changes, it's not an issue of, hey, you're supporting BLM. Hey, you're not supporting your own community. Because another thing with BLM, our intention is our brand equity has been very skewed by the media. We have people that are judging us based off 30-second ads they might have seen on YouTube. They have no clue who we are. They think we're all people that don't have jobs or just out here, just bums. Whereas most of us, actually, about 70% of our group are students and working an actual job to support themselves through school and doing this. It's insane to see, but there's not a middle ground, because we're so polarized right now that there's no room for conversation. So we need context is what we need. We need people in these city official roles to have these conversations with people like that. And as of right now, that's where we're currently at. And it's hard to continue this without having to, for me at least, to just say a big thank you to kind of like the other BLM chapters around us, because for me, I started out protesting with them. And if anything, they're the folks that inspired us to start our group, first and foremost. And second, they're the ones that supported us when we started our group and gave us advice. So Des Moines BLM, the Iowa Freedom Riders, and Iowa City have been very pivotal in that sense and helped us a lot. But particularly in regards to protesting, there's so much more I can kind of go into and talk about. However, I want to make sure at the end of the day, I'm providing y'all as much context as possible and, as much value as possible. So I'm kind of curious to hear what questions y'all might have, or what things you particularly might want to hear about regarding our experiences as a group, or even my own personal experiences.
If no one has any questions, I have a couple questions for you, Ahmed. So for someone who's like just starting out, I guess, what would you recommend, I guess, in terms of like planning, getting supplies, things like that? Like what are kind of the first steps that you should do when going out to protest?
For sure. If you're looking to start your first protest, I would say first and foremost, it goes to coalition building. The last thing you're going to want is to go out into the streets and not have numbers, right? At the end of the day, when it comes to doing these things, you really only have two assets, and that's numbers and the element of surprise. No one knows what you're doing, what routes you're going to be taking, what you're going to be talking about. They don't know what to expect. So first and foremost, get your coalition, make sure you have your first asset solidified and that exists, right? After that, how are you going to reach a larger audience, right? It's one thing to say, I created my own Instagram page, my own Facebook page, right? A Twitter page. You can market on your own page, but you also need to find community leaders, community influencers that align with your action plan, and then are also going to help you market this material just so you can make sure you're going to have larger numbers. So make sure you have those two. Third thing you need to consider is, what route are we going to take? What are we going to be talking about when we're on these routes, right? It comes back to action plan. How is your action plan tied into your protest? What are your goals? And then on top of that, how can we ensure everyone's going to be safe, right? The last thing you want to do is be responsible for 200 plus people and have these people get hurt, and you knowing you're the person that put this together and they came out for this. But things like this do happen, but you have to ensure that you do things to mitigate that, right? If you're in a place like Ames, right, we typically take up the whole street when we protest. So what we want to take up is, we want to ensure that all sides of the streets are covered. So we literally have 4 cars in the front of the group and then 4 cars in the back. And prior to starting this protest, we have safety rules that we make everyone repeat, right? First one is, do not pass the lead vehicle. You're not allowed to pass any of the lead vehicles while you're marching. And if you cannot keep up with the crowd, go to the sidewalk, because you're not allowed to be behind the back vehicles. Because the last thing we need is someone getting behind and getting caught up like that. And then after that, you need alignment, and you're understanding that, hey, we want safety, and it's your job to not just be accountable for yourself, but be accountable for others. Because one thing we do see is, we'll have cops that come in undercover in our protest, just dressed in their day-to-day clothes, but they're very clear identified, because they have that military buzz cut, those military tattoos, and like they stick out like a sore thumb and look extremely uncomfortable in the situation. As well as we have white supremacists who also come in undercover, and their intent sometimes could be, I want to just simply get information about what's going on, figure out who's leading what. Or sometimes their intent can be, I want to screw this up for them. I want to mess this up. I want to make BLM look bad. And you'll have people that will literally start chanting, like, break this down, like break down a window or whatever it might be. Or like, let's pretty much anything they can do to make you look bad. And you have to make sure people are not accountable just for themselves, but their peers around them. So they have to call things out, and we make sure that that's something that folks understand prior to marching. But I would say those are kind of like the main key elements to consider if you want to protest, and making sure you have those things done.
We have a couple questions in the chat as well. First one is your campus, is it more of a blue or more liberal kind of area, and a red area or state or county? And how do you expand beyond the institution?
For sure, that's a great question. The campus is a mix-up. So the campus, Iowa State's about 30,000 folks, whereas the city population of Ames is about 67,000. So it's almost half the city. The issue is, although we have some folks that might be more liberal, a lot of the folks here are from Iowa, right? They typically don't see people that look like me. They don't have that context. They don't understand my history, as well as, like most of history, due to the fact that our history is not part of the core curriculum. It's an elective at the end of the day. So it's a balance between blue or red, but you'll see things on campus as like people put up swastikas, people will, vandalize, buildings and write, like things as just racist stuff all the time. Like it happens at least minimal 5 times a semester. And it's just something that's the university does to cover up, but it's it's tough in that sense. But at the same time, also another thing for that second question to touch up on is how you expand beyond the institution. You really just have to find out who are the community leaders, not on my campus, but who are the community leaders in the city. And with this being mostly kind of a college town, it's not easy to do due to the fact that most students are not involved in as residents. But for us, we've just been able to identify, okay, who's actually doing the work in regards to working with, troubled youth here in Ames, being able to identify those type of folks, being able to identify who's working with homeless populations here in Ames, but being able to just find out who's already doing the community work outside the institution is fairly easy if you just kind of do some Googling, or better yet, even ask some of the professors because they do live here. So that was kind of our avenue getting tapped into the community, but how do we also get buy-in from the community was another thing. You have to sometimes be strategic with your events. You can't always have protests. So for us, to get community buy-in, we do things like have bi-weekly drive-ins, right? People will donate stuff, right? For Halloween, we had people donate, costumes, and we pretty much ended up washing them, and then giving them back to youth in that community, right? Because people in that community, all they see sometimes is just us protesting, but they don't see that community work we do. But that's, I'd say, one of the biggest things you can do to expand beyond the institution, as well as get the buy-in from the community.
Yeah, jumping off that, there's I guess a question that you might have kind of already covered, but is there any additional advice that you would give for coalition building and really engaging members who want to join and want to go out and put on events and protests, and again you mentioned reaching out to your community leaders, so are there any other good places to kind of start with reaching out to, I guess, especially if you live in a small town?
Yeah, for sure. With coalition building, I think we have to take I think you really just have to comprehend the fact that this is not a moment, this is a movement. Like activism doesn't mean just you going out to the streets. It's much bigger than that. It's much bigger, right? We talk about legislation, right? Figuring out who's pushing for that type of legislation, finding those key people, right? You see it, activism in healthcare, right? Like today, a Black woman is 4 times more likely to die giving birth than any other type of one. Why is that a thing? There are people that are literally like going into medicine strictly to fix these type of problems, finding people like that, right? And a coalition doesn't always mean that they're just gonna be marching with you, but these are people that are gonna be helping you with your cause. All right. And then there's also, you have school boards, right? There's people on school boards that are particularly trying to target, students of color and trying to uplift them and trying to make sure that, the retention rates are going up. Also trying to figure out, okay, we have folks that are working with, the troubled populations here as well as the homeless populations. But literally just think of every single facet of racism and literally just trying to identify who's been doing that work here, right? People do that for their 9 to 5. Finding those people will literally, they're pretty much the gatekeepers to the rest of the community most of the time because of the work they're doing. But no one is one single gatekeeper for the entire community. So you're not going to just run into one person that's just going to bring you maybe, 500 people, right? So networking is huge, and coalition building is not something simple as I'm going to talk to maybe, 5 people, but in reality, you should be aiming to talk to at least 100. So it's not an easy thing to do, but if you're able to effectively do it, there's no reason as to why you can't have an effective turnout. But I would say by far it is the most important component to the work that relates to protesting, as well as just even international relations and decolonization itself.
And you definitely mentioned some barriers that you face, like community members maybe not having the time, in city council positions really not paying enough. So how do you guys work past those barriers?
For sure. Particularly in regards to folks getting burnt out and not having enough time. We have to remember, like, activism doesn't just come in one form. Some people are already doing this with the work they're doing, and that alone itself can be tiring, right? You have to be compassionate, understanding, and knowing that this person is already doing something big, and what they're doing might not be them protesting, but it's a much bigger long-term goal and vision, right? You have to understand the fact that that itself is important too. And if anything, you should, rather than being mad at them that they can't come out to protest, you should say, how can I support you? Right? Because this is something that's going to continue for years and years. It's a process at the end of the day. Uh, but also asking for references, asking, do you know of anyone else I might be able to talk to? Right? Like, think of it as like literally like a sports team. You're going to need subs. No one person is going to be able to play just back-to-back games every single day. People get burnt out and you need subs, and that's why it's important to have a coalition, because in times of need, you can have other people on your team to step up. And then in regards to city council, it's tough. That's literally what, yeah, like y'all know much more about politics than I do. It's hard, right? When people are decision makers and you're not the one there, and you clearly see that there's an issue, yet they're not making the decisions you want to see, you have to find ways around that. For us, we're trying to find, okay, they have a vested interest in the city. That's undeniable. And if they don't, they're instantly going to get replaced. We won't have any problem getting the city riled up about not wanting them here if we can say this is not a BLM issue, but this is a community issue. Because also other community members they're not educated on us and what we do. The words BLM alone they're off-putting to some people. So we have to find some sort of alignment, right? So for us, we're able to kind of, to be real, you have to be political, right? You have to find spins. We already know what the community issues are, but we're still going to do this project to say this information came from marginalized communities, right? We already know what issues are going to come up. It won't be a surprise, but in that sense, we're going to be able to say these city council members heard from the Ames community, and after hearing the issues of the Ames community, they chose to do X, Y, Z, right? Regardless of whether you support BLM or not, if you support the city of Ames and try and make this a better place, you can get behind that. So you have to understand what will people get behind, what people won't get behind, but you also have to play it politically. And then that's not an easy thing to do, and that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to take a lot of time. But I would say that's in regards to that, getting actionable change. That's probably the part where I probably lose the most sleep. But it's something I would say find people that are experienced in that realm. So we actually have some state legislators that are very supportive of us, and they publicly support us. We talk to them about these type of things, and we get their advice, because for me, I'm not a city council member. I haven't served in a political position. Like, I lobbied for the Department of State, but that was about international education, right? That's easy to get behind. Do you believe that we should have more people from the US with an inclusive worldview? There wasn't a single senator or representative that said no. That was just an instant yes. Whereas this, they're thinking about, oh, am I going to lose my reelection over this? Right? Am I going to be able to continue my political career? How will my peers in my party view me now if I want to maybe further advance my career? They have other things running through their head. But if we can spin it in the way of, this is what your community asked for, they're able to tell themselves now, I'm doing this for the community. I'm not doing this for BLM. Because some of them are very drawn. Some of them might want to do the right thing, but they're just afraid of how their community might judge them due to the fact that they did it for quote unquote BLM, when in reality it was to better our community.
And someone else in the chat would really like to hear more about your organization experience on the streets as opposed to on campus, and communicating with local decision makers.
For sure. In regards to like the actual experiences that we've had during protests, or in regards to our community work?
Let's see. Doesn't specify.
This is my question. I would
Okay.
say, because I'm based in DC and not a college student anymore, would love to know how I know you said it's a college town, but if you have experiences organizing outside of that college setting and communicating with not college faculty and professors, but because I live in DC, right outside the White House, we're talking about actual like legislation makers and decision makers. So if you have any experience with that, I'd love to for you to expand.
Yeah, for sure. My experience is limited in that realm, but so a lot of the organizers in Iowa City, which with a large population there, they give a much bigger community turnout. But I kind of grew up with them and helped out a little bit there. But with that work, it was a matter of just tapping into like literally just going to the hood, like you going into subsidized housing and like knocking doors, sometimes even just letting them know we exist, like we're here to help you, we're trying to drive this agenda. Let people know and like let them be a champion on your behalf and like let them spread the word for you, because sometimes we think we're going to have to do all the legwork, but in reality it's not feasible to put that on one person, and a person can do that. I myself, during a time was probably spending hours on hours, but I got burnt out real quick, and your body will tell you before anyone else. Like sometimes your friends will, but if you don't listen to your friends, like your body will tell you and get you to the point of just saying, hey, sit down, take a break. So I would say if you're looking to just do street work, really just tap into the community, say, here's my goal, here's what I'm gonna do, and just get everyone you like literally come by, just have them hear your goals. That itself is enough for them to just tell other people in the community. And then also have a way they can reach you, whether it is social media or whether it's, through like other avenues, but communicate your goals to the streets and have a way the streets can reach you, as well as have an avenue for them to also get involved, whether it's telling other people, maybe even running those social media accounts themselves, whether it's maybe helping fundraising or helping continue to build that coalition alongside with you, but really just tapping into the community and building that.
You guys in the audience, feel free to pop more questions in the chat as you think of them. Personally, I'm kind of curious about, how I guess the media has shaped your goals or kind of helped, I don't know, pursue your platform in any way or helped kind of promote that. So has like the local press and Ames, have they been involved at all in kind of, sending along your message?
Yeah, for sure. It's been a challenge with the media due to the fact that there's not anyone in that realm that looks like us. First and foremost, with it being Iowa, that itself is a challenge alone, but also if you look in, one thing we ended up doing was we didn't want to give stories to any of the journalists unless we knew them or even dug into them. So we literally actually ended up digging into all the folks that worked at the Ames Tribune, like looking through their Twitter, have any of them even talked about anything that might have been related to BLM issues before? If not, we refuse to take any stories from them. We refuse to even like discuss with them. And for us, it was tough because when they covered our stories, they only covered our protests. There were never any community events showing the work we were doing within our community and any of that work. All they would do is saying, oh, this group's protesting. And the people that weren't out there, all they hear is, oh, BLM is just out here in the streets protesting, and they're not doing else outside of that. They're not there to talk to us, or they're not covering our story in regards to talking to our city council members. They're not talking about our stories about talking to Iowa State. They're not talking about our stories about trying to work with the school board to implement change within, the K through 12 education system. They're literally only there during the protest. And we had a huge issue with that too, is because they would also take pictures of our protesters and have everyone's faces there. What that does is people are being put out there, right? Like BLM, as we said, like people have a skewed image of what it is. And there's people that are just racist and they don't want to see that, right? Especially in Iowa. Having your picture up there makes you a target at the end of the day. Not everyone's comfortable with putting their face out there. So we literally ended up finding these journalists that we specifically trust and told them, you're the only ones that are invited to our protest. Outside of you, like we're kicking out anyone else from the media. So we would literally, before starting a protest and starting a march, we would literally go find, okay, who here works at the media? Were they allowed? If they weren't allowed to come, we'd literally announce the fact that, hey, we don't want them here, here's why. And we just pretty much shun them and like we get them kicked out and like they'd feel extremely uncomfortable and leave. And then with the folks that we did trust, we had trainings for them. We would tell them, okay, here's why you should never have a picture of someone's face. And if you do take a picture of someone's face, make sure you blur it out for this reason. And if you don't want to blur it out, ask for their permission first, right? You can't just put that out. Second, another thing is if you're going to work with us, you're not allowed to only just show up to protest. You have to be at our community events. You have to be there when we're talking to the school board. You're going to have to cover the stories of us talking to Iowa State. You also have to be there when we talk to city council. All of that needs to be covered. The whole story needs to be told. And on top of that, make sure you're actually not telling the story in a skewed way. Like we don't want any BS that's going to paint us out to be like villains out here when in reality we're just trying to help our community.
Yeah, all those things that you mentioned sound really important in order to kind of, keep your message like as it is and not have it be skewed in any way, because that can definitely be a detriment to like, your messaging and all of that. So I think those are really important points that you just made. And
So a little bit more on that too is I would want to say too, I think media is probably second after coalition building, probably the next most important thing for a movement, particularly in the fact that you can even study history. In any revolution, they're not going straight to the president's palace or the president's place. They're going to the media. They go turn over the media, put out a narrative, and after putting out that narrative and like telling their story, after that, then they're going to the presidents and overthrowing the institution. No one ever goes straight to the institution if you look at the history of revolutions. That's just something that's seldom done, especially in today's age. So media is extremely important in that sense. So make sure you're putting a lot of time and effort into that.
Yeah, thank you for again making those points. Super important. I was wondering also if you could just talk a little bit about your podcast and what you do with that.
Yeah, for sure. So my podcast is called In the Hilda, which is Arabic for in the neighborhood. When I originally had the idea for my podcast, I was thinking about issues we see within our communities today, particularly low-income neighborhoods. For me, a little bit about my story, give some more context to you. When I first moved to the States, I was originally living in Sudan, like right next to the Nile River, and moved to the States and now living in subsidized housing. It was a very different turn in perspective for me. It was a very different life I saw, particularly in regards to, I have drug dealers living next to me. I'm seeing people take routes in life that I haven't seen before. Although I've seen extreme poverty in Sudan, I hadn't seen, things like shootouts. Like, I had days where in my neighborhood, I'd wake up to gunshots and see flashes in my window and just be like, okay, I know this is not a life I want for myself. Yeah, as a kid, I was very fortunate to have parents that used to work in engineers back in Sudan. So I had seen another life, another perspective, but a lot of kids in my neighborhood, they didn't see that. When they looked for examples of success, particularly for people that looked like them, most of the time it didn't exist, right? You might see it manifest through athletics, which in reality is not really feasible due to the fact that your chances of making it to be a professional athlete are 1 in a billion, literally. So your success rate is extremely low. And on top of that, let's say you are a great athlete, you got injured, what's your backup plan? That's another thing we're not talking to kids about. Second, you might see somebody, pursue being an artist, which also very low chances of success. And third is you might see the examples of success being a street artist or like a street pharmacist in reality, like a drug dealer. So for me, I'm just like, what can I do to address this? We need more kids in these communities seeing people that are doctors, people that are entrepreneurs, equity owners, people that are in politics, people that are just doing the things that we typically don't see, right? Because our earning potential is capped. We really need to address this issue. So for my podcast, one thing I focus on is just really just using that platform to serve as that example. I have software engineers on there. I have actually Jeremiah, one of the folks that actually put this together, someone in international relations, is on there. I have brought in a venture capitalist who works for Mubalda, which is a sovereign wealth fund. So the United Arab Emirates, all the money they get from oil, pretty much his job is to invest that money and make more money. Kids in low-income neighborhoods are never going to see people like that. And yet he's someone from a low-income neighborhood, which is another thing. If you're in a low-income neighborhood, your goal is to get out the hood, right? And you're going to get a nicer house or a nicer place, but you're not going to be next to the hood again due to the fact that property values And the way, you know, redlining is, you're not going to see someone that has a $300,000 home next to the hood. It doesn't work like that. So serving as that example is the biggest thing. And one thing I'm currently doing with my podcast is trying to expand it further, because it's one thing to listen to an interview, but it's a whole other thing to have a dialogue and have your own conversations. So I'm actually in the process of setting up webinars and then be having some more speakers coming in. I got the president of media sales for BET, a president of an IT company, also the founder of Redbox, and I'm hopefully going to bring in the first Black mayor of Iowa City here pretty soon too.
That's awesome. That's a really awesome goal to have. And I'm really rooting for you and getting that engagement and just reaching minorities and people of color and anyone else who may not have that kind of representation.
I appreciate it.
Of course. And do you have a couple more questions that just came in? So the first one, so this person says, I teach at a private university where our student population is becoming increasingly more interested in getting engaged in protest and civil disobedience, but they come from kind of varying positions of privilege. Do you have any suggestions for how those students enter those spaces? And what education practices and teachings can they consult to come from a place of humility?
For sure. Just so I heard the question right, it was, you have, you know, students that are interested in protest, but particularly they come from privileged backgrounds, you said, or?
Yeah, varying positions of privilege. So maybe, you know, students with a little bit more, how can they, you know, come from a better place of humility, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. We're actually doing something, we're working with some actually students from that background, exactly in that exact situation from the Ames High School here. I would say first and foremost, as an educator, giving them context, right? As kids, no child's gonna be born with hate in their heart, right? But they're gonna be faced with opposition. They're not gonna understand how to handle that. They're not gonna know what to say in those situations. Sometimes, you know, it's gonna get really emotional. And sometimes you gotta understand, you don't take it personal, even when you know it is, because your mental energy should not, it's gonna take up so much of your energy if you do that. So give them context, show them, all right, here's the historical context of what has happened, what is currently happening, and here are the efforts we're currently seeing that are already being done, right? They don't have to create like the wheel. They can literally find examples around them. So one thing we've done here in Ames High School is they want to give back to, you know, marginalized communities. So we are actually working with the high school students to put together a local community garden. We actually did this a while back, but we got a community garden together where folks can come in, you know, get vegetables, and it's for free for everyone, for the community. But something that simple can be huge, because it shows, you know, actual adults that, hey, these are kids doing this. And if anything, it's invigorating for adults to see that, because it ignites energy in them. But I would say the biggest thing you can do as educators is give them that context, and if anything, just empower them to do these projects, but let them choose their own projects. Just show them the examples, because I think people do a lot better when they're intrinsically motivated to do things they want to do. And tell them to be safe, because again, that opposition sometimes can be very strong in some scenarios.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. We have another question that came in as well. So you mentioned that, you know, a lot of history is left out of mainstream curricula and canon, especially growing up in schools. You know, large parts of Black history are just omitted and only reserved for elective classes. So how possible is it to influence the range of just texts and discussion topics chosen by professors that teach history and other missing topics at your university?
I think it's extremely doable. It's a matter of just a signature in reality. At the end of the day, like, for me, it's something that really, it makes me very mad. As someone that grew up in Sudan, like, I hadn't seen a white person until I came to Iowa. Like, right, I'm flying over to Iowa, and like the plane I'm flying in is all Black, and we get to Frankfurt, Germany for our transfer. And I get out of the airport, and like, it's the first time I see white folks, and I'm in shock. I'm like, y'all are real? Like, I've only seen y'all on TV. This is crazy. I get to Iowa, there's no one that looks like me, but in reality, back home, every book, every writer, every textbook was people that looked like me. It exists. It's not anything crazy. Yet for some reason, when we look at, peer-reviewed articles, it's typically the only people that are reviewing are people from these institutions. But I think all it takes is just someone to pinpoint the issue and literally just call it out and continue to strive for that. But I think there's a huge need for it today because literally the majority of textbooks just come from mostly just North America and Europe, right? We need to diversify the types of information we get because we're missing out on a lot of perspectives. But I think for me, it's something that is crucial and needs to be done. But maybe I just want to make sure I'm answering the question correctly. Is what we're asking, is it possible, or is there another question there? Are you asking if it's possible to do in all classes at our university?
Yeah, the person who asked the question can chime in as well if I'm not explaining it properly. But I think they're asking, how, I guess, to what extent is it possible that we can essentially decolonize curricula at university? Like, do those professors, I guess, have that authority and power to do so?
Yeah, professors at the end of the day make suggestions for their textbooks. Like, for example, my thermodynamics professor wrote his own thermodynamics textbook, and he's the one that chooses which textbooks we use. So he ended up choosing his textbooks and drove up his revenue. But professors, it depends on the university you go to. I think it might vary depending on university, but Iowa State, it's really just chosen by the professor themselves. So there are some professors that are a little bit, more knowledgeable, but end up doing that. But if we, in reality, talk to every professor, we might actually maybe see a jump and an increase in the variety of textbooks we see. But that's something we're also trying to see as a focal point, but we're trying to not necessarily focus on talking to professors, but rather have it be an implemented policy here at Iowa State instead, just so something that's more sustainable. Because, right, as in that, if we get just replaced for maybe a couple semesters, it's one thing, but new professors are going to come in and things change. So having it as a policy would be much bigger in that sense.
Do you think it would be possible for students to kind of rally together to help implement that kind of policy? And I guess if so, what do you think would need to be done for that to happen?
For sure. I think if anything, it could be as simple as not even as us as BLM going out to go do it, but in reality, we can gather up plenty of students around just this one issue alone. And I think we actually have a student org or a group here at Iowa State that someone's particularly just want to tackle this issue and issue alone, and is trying to gather some student orgs together just to tackle this issue and reach out to more professors about this. But for us, we're just particularly focused on the policy component. But I think it's extremely possible. And I think there's a huge need for it because one thing they're not going to educate us on is a lot of the historical context of, for example, like, Africa has more resources than any other continent in the world. Yet, poorest country. Like by the end of this year, Guinea, the country of Guinea will have lost multiple feet of elevation just due to mining. Like the deals for mining in that country are worth more than the GDP of the whole country. Right. So like they're actually losing feet of their country and it's being shipped off to places like North America, Europe, and China. And things like that they're not being taught. And like we need that type of context for the next generation of leaders.
And I think we might have time for just one more question. So there's someone who asks, are there things that you feel have failed, I guess, in your BLM chapter or maybe, other organizations that you might have worked with? And how have you changed your actions based on that reflection of kind of things gone wrong?
Yeah, we failed a lot. And I think it's like protesting, like I said, there's not a curriculum for this. Like all these things I'm telling you, it's because we messed up. Like what we told you about putting cars in front of your protest and behind your protesters, literally in Iowa City, they had somebody drive through like a wave of protesters. And then we were lucky to also get in touch with the Des Moines medics. We had our own medics there present just for that scenario. But some of the key failures for us was we didn't understand at first the importance of that coalition building, because our first protest, we had about a good turnout. We had about 200 plus people. Next protest, numbers are going up. And then next protest after that, no one, we literally barely get any people. We're under 100. It's probably not safe with that small amount of people to take up a whole street. Yet we had to sit back and be like, okay, why can't we get that turnout? Well, we can't just protest. Like we need time in between for the people to literally just digest what's going on, as well as take time to take a break. Because our own organizers themselves, sometimes we have action items like we have to market things out to other organizations. We understand the importance of that till the students came back, because we realized, oh, we only have community members because we started in the summer. Most students weren't there. We were missing out a big chunk of the student population. So marketing through student orgs, giving them our flyers, and then they send us their student members. Another big failure was burnout. I'd say that was the biggest one. Like sustainability is huge. Like for me personally, that summer, I was doing a summer accelerator program and was going to start a boot camp trying to build up a company. And on top of that, I was working for the National Society of Black Engineers. Right, I'm on national. I just recently just joined the national board for that. And on top of that, I'm trying to, start BLM chapter and working with that. I was able to do, I was putting a lot of hours. I was not getting that much sleep. And like I said, sometimes your friends will tell you, hey, you should take a break. But for me, I'm just like, no, this is important. I have to keep going. I got burnt out, and it's the point where my body literally just told me like, hey, this is not sustainable. I ended up just really getting to a bad mental state. And for me, that mental energy was huge because I was in a place where I felt extremely disconnected from all my friends. Every conversation I went into, I didn't feel like I cared for. I was very irritable. Every conversation I was had, just very irritable, on edge. But that is probably, I'd say, the most important thing. Like sustainability is huge. You will fail. Like you will definitely fail if you think you're just going to go out here and just protest every day. And it's you doing all the coordination and you doing all this work. You need people around you and you need subs. Like you need people to be able to step up when you're not present. If like I fall down, I need someone there to pick me up, right? And vice versa. Like my team members need that too. But I'd say the biggest failure for us was burnout, because in the summer we had students that had jobs that were helping us. That now school starts, they got full-time course load too, and their goal is to graduate, right? They want to better their family and escape poverty and be able to make even a bigger impact. I wasn't the only one that got burnt out. The majority of us did. Our head of communications was working 2 internships while also being a full-time student. That didn't pan out too well for us, right? That's why we had those slip ups with marketing. But at the same time, none of us are going to go up to her and say, hey, like you failed. No, like you need to take a break. It's actually the opposite. So I would say that's the biggest thing. Like really understand it's not about managing your time, it's about managing your energy.
Yeah, I think that's kind of something really interesting that we can kind of tie back to the DIR 101 panel. And we talked kind of about having a very targeting your anger into very positive activities. And I think this is a part of that, because I mean, I think being angry and frustrated with the state of things is very mentally taxing. So I think what you said about like managing your mental health is very important component of that. And actually, yeah.
I was a little bit more on that. We did actually also try to set up something for our community members too, where we're still working on this, but setting up something that allows them to, have those positive spaces to have those discussions about how they're feeling and with everything that's going on. Make sure you can create some sort of safe space for you, your group members, as well as those in your community, if you can take it to that step. But it's crucial because, movements are only as strong as its leaders, right? And you can't say you're doing well if you're in reality, mentally not holding up.
That's very, very true. We do actually have more time until 3 o'clock. And so we do have another question that came in that I'll read off. What do you think is the most helpful form of support that people can give to coalitions if they're unable to directly join them? We have COVID, for example, and stay-at-home orders, and people might not feel comfortable going out on the streets. You mentioned donations, contextualizing movements for others, and expanding representation of marginalized groups in ways to engage with decision makers. But are there any other forms of support that you have found to be the most helpful?
Yeah, for sure. I actually get this question a lot from folks in our community that always want to help, but sometimes, whether it's due to COVID, they can't come out, or due to some certain restrictions. But for people of color, I tell them, like, first and foremost, remember, like, activism takes many different forms, right? Like, your existence itself is an act of defiance, right? Like, if your goal is if you're a business owner, today, over 95% of, or less than 5% actually, of CEOs are Native American, Black, or Latino, whereas over 90% are just white men, right? So you even doing that alone is an act of activism, right? If you're, someone that is privileged, check your privilege, right? Furthermore, if you are checking your privilege, the next step is, do not be complicit in this system, right? When you're in spaces and you're in rooms and you see something that is going down, and you typically see someone saying something they're not supposed to be saying, call it out, right? You are not going to make progress if people just think, oh, this is just the way it is, right? That's why we have people that just are they don't think there is an issue. Like, I talked to the president of Iowa State, and she sent out a statement. Her statement is just after George Floyd was murdered. Half of it was glorifying the police. The other half didn't even mention anything about Black Lives Matter, or voiced the fact that, hey, we need to support our student population. And when I asked her about it, she said, I pretty much told her, like, I gave her a history lesson on why that's not okay, and why she should be supporting our students, and why Black students don't feel supported. She literally said, I'm not talking to our Black students, I'm talking to our white students. And we have the vice president of diversity and inclusion on that call. So I took a pause. I'm like, I'm gonna see if they're gonna check this. And it's just crickets for like 5 to 6 seconds. Until I just pretty much started speaking. But you have to understand that we ourselves, as an individual, you're not going to be the one change maker for the world, and no one is going to be that, right? Our communities don't need a leader, they need leaders, plural. Like, we need multiple people. So in every space that you come into, have context and be willing and not afraid to check people's privilege and let them know that, hey, this is not the right thing. But there are many ways to do that, right? Your day-to-day life is one. If you want to go further, we mentioned donating, we mentioned talking to our city council members, talking to youth and educating them properly too is another big thing. On top of that, what type of content are you yourself consuming, and how are you kind of promoting that type of content, right? So, like, you share the information you have with others and educate them too if you can. But I understand everyone's time is limited. We only have so much time in a day. So make sure you're also doing something that's sustainable and not burning yourself out, because your success is important to this movement. And if it's anything, it's the most foundational component. After you ensure success for yourself, this is when everything after that is second.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And you mentioned before with, we actually do have another question come in. So this question is, do you provide your BLM members with strategies to ameliorate the trauma that they may relive during protests? Things like meditation, tapping, etc.
Yeah, for sure. I mentioned, one thing we're working to do is create some safe spaces for folks to have conversations. But another thing we've also done is, like, we have like events that also I'm going to talk about, but we've had days where we really just had community yoga. So opportunities for people to de-stress and things like that. But it's hard. It's really hard due to the fact that, it's not easy to do. And, like, when you're unpacking trauma, one conversation isn't enough, one event isn't enough. It's also upon you as a person to be comfortable and being vulnerable and being able to say, I acknowledge the fact that you have trauma, but also talk to others about it, because being vulnerable is not an easy thing, especially for Black folks. We're taught that it's weakness in reality, but in reality, that's not what it is. Like, being vulnerable, if anything, it's it shows strength. It shows, you know, you're courageous. But our community doesn't do enough of that, and our community has been taught that that's not what it is. Whereas in other communities, you know, it's more, you're more likely to see people go to therapy, whereas there's a stigma around it. So if anything, we have to unteach people that stigma first and foremost, and then from there, try to get them to just simply feel comfortable. And I think that comes back to having those safe spaces, but it takes time. It really does take a lot of time.
Yeah, it definitely takes time to kind of, you know, especially build those relationships and create a space where people feel safe. It's definitely, I mean, like you said, it's not something that can happen instantaneously, but it is super important to have. And I guess on, if you have any last comments, please feel free to share them with us.
Yeah,
If
for
not,
sure.
yeah.
I'm first and foremost just want to say, you know, thank you everyone for putting this together, as well as thank you everyone for, you know, coming to this workshop and asking some amazing questions, as well as, you know, staying engaged. I really appreciate all of you. So thank you for that. Uh, Last but not least, I know I mentioned a couple of things. Uh, if you ever looking to engage in further dialogue or just want to connect with me, I would say please reach out. Don't hesitate. I'm gonna here. I can drop my I can drop my LinkedIn in the comments, so y'all can feel free to reach out to me that way. But I'm always open to engaging with y'all, having further dialogue. And then if you're interested in checking out the podcast, I can drop the link there in the chat as well. But last but not least, just thank you everyone. I really appreciate y'all, and looking forward to seeing the rest of the conference with all of you, because there's going to be more exciting things to see. So please do tune in to see all these other speakers.
Great. Thank you so much, Ahmed. It was really great having you speaking to us, and I'll definitely be sure to connect with you. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and everyone else, I hope you enjoy it as well. We have a couple panels coming up. We have the gender panel and global health coming up. So feel free to join those. All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right, y'all. Have a good one.